Good afternoon. My name is Jane Smith and my co-author is Julie Rosati. We're both at the Engineer Research and Development Center, Coastal and Hydraulics Lab at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And our topic is coastal resilience in the U.S. Following decades of extreme coastal events, we know more about what unresilient communities look like. This is due to rapid growth with limited insight into the long-term natural coastal processes and historical trends. We sometimes think we can build anything, anywhere, that we can control nature. The result has been flooding, infrastructure failure, shoreline erosion, environmental degradation, and loss of life. Some coastal projects or protection measures may in the long term increase risk by increasing development in vulnerable areas. 52% of the US population lives in coastal watersheds, and the US has 147,000 kilometers of coastal shoreline. This table shows the impacts of hurricanes in the US. This is the top 10 ranked storms in terms of hurricane damage. The damage is due to extreme storm surge, thinking Hurricane Katrina, heavy rainfall. Hurricane Harvey had rainfall up to 1.5 meters locally, extreme winds and extreme waves, or some combination of those. In the past 40 years, there's been almost $2 trillion in tropical cyclone losses in the US. The ongoing challenge of coastal resilience is exacerbated by climate change. We tend to focus on sea level rise. This plot shows projected sea level rise out to 2100 based on different emission scenarios. These numbers are pretty daunting, but there's other factors that need to be considered as well. Temperature increases, ocean acidification, permafrost loss, changing storm tracks and storm frequencies, and hurricane intensification. Impacts of these climate changes will vary by ecosystem type, human systems that are impacted, and the region of the country. Local subsidence and rebound are important to the evaluation of sea level rise locally. Subsidence caused by human activity is currently the most important cause of relative sea level change in many deltaic areas. Here's an example of coastal Louisiana. So I've spent a lot of time talking about some of the resilient factors, but I haven't really defined coastal resilience yet. We define resilience as the capacity to anticipate and plan for disturbances, resist the damages or absorb the impacts, recover rapidly, and then adapt to the stressors of the changing conditions and constraints. We see this as a cycle. Before a storm comes, we work to adapt. As a storm is upon us, we want to prepare for that storm. During the storm, absorb the impacts, and then after the storm, recover quickly, and then start preparing for the next storm. Oftentimes, we focus on engineering infrastructure, things like gates and levees and coastal structures, but we also need to consider the environmental infrastructure, beaches and dunes and marshes, and the community infrastructure, including things like transportation networks, communication networks. So all of these factors come together in evaluating coastal resilience. We know that climate change is a driver for our sea level hazards, whether it be mean sea level rise or the extreme sea levels that we see during storms. These force the coastal hazards, things like land submergence, flooding, coastal erosion, ecosystem loss, and that has direct impacts. But there's other factors too. Some of these other climate-related factors that we talked about of temperature increases, permafrost loss, and there's non-climate factors such as anthropogenic drivers. These would include things like land use, risk perception, and human-induced ecosystem degradation. And so those impacts are things like loss of land, loss of ecosystem services, loss of life and injury, and damage to the built environment or the human activities. There's been a lot of discussion lately about compound events. Some of these events are correlated. Some have common forcing, like extratropical or tropical storms, where you have rainfall, surge, and waves. Examples of those would be Hurricane Harvey, which I've already mentioned, or Hurricane Isaac. Sometimes these are very heavy rainfall events or stationary storms. And they affect areas that are very flat, where there's very limited ability to the water to drain off, such as New Orleans or Houston, or very steep topography, where the water can come down very quickly and then pond, or where you might have an earthquake and a tsunami. There's also cases where there's mutual reinforcement between events or clustered events. One example would be a combined river flood and surge. In 2019, the Mississippi River had a very long duration flood, extended into hurricane season. Hurricane Barry hit near New Orleans and increased the flood levels in the Mississippi River about 30 centimeters. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot, but this was a river that was already at flood stage. Another example is Hurricanes Dennis and Floyd in the North Carolina area. Dennis came by, pushed water into the Pamlico Sound estuary, and then Hurricane Floyd followed Dennis before the estuary had time to drain out, causing increased flooding levels. And there's also cases of conditional dependence, where you might have saturated soils with rain or surge events, with the water having no place to seep in. Or combined sea level rise, subsidence, and extreme spring tides. This is sometimes referred to as fair weather flooding. And this happens in San Francisco, Norfolk, Virginia, or Honolulu, Hawaii. And sometimes even just the correspondence of tides and surge. Hurricane Sandy hit New York, about southern area of New York, and the Battery right at high tide, increasing the flood levels. The compounding factors don't have to be physical, but they could be anthropogenic. What we've experienced this year has been COVID-19, and we've been very concerned about that with hurricane season right on top of it. So those two events coming together could increase both the local spread or the regional spread of the disease. It could cause additional loss of life because people decide not to evacuate, or some of the emergency resources are already saturated. And it could also cause additional disruption to health service if there's flooding in hospitals, which means people wouldn't have access to emergency care. We've already talked about climate change, but there's also environmental factors where humans may change the topography or the bathymetry, the vegetation, the land cover, and that affects the resilience of the coast as well. This figure shows our basic coastal engineering strategies. First one is to do nothing. The second one, which we see used a lot, is to build protection, whether it be levees or seawalls, revetments, to prevent communities and try to make them more resilient. Another method is accommodation, where we may raise structures to allow flooding to occur underneath them. Or we may even advance the shoreline in areas where the land is very valuable. We may retreat, although that's often not a popular method to go about it. Or what we've been talking about more recently is ecosystem-based adaptation. Are these different strategies resilient? Which ones of them will make us more resilient in the long term? I'd like to talk somewhat about this ecosystem-based adaptation. The Corps of Engineers calls this natural and nature-based features, using natural features to achieve not only coastal engineering benefits, but also ecosystem benefits. We've got some ongoing efforts now to summarize the state of knowledge, to quantify some of these, quantify what the capacity is to provide these engineering and ecosystem services, to develop models, to represent them, and to provide some guidance. We break natural nature-based features into 5 different categories. The first one is beaches and dunes, vegetated features such as wetlands or marshes, reefs, oyster reefs, coral reefs, rock reefs, barrier islands or island structures, and maritime forest and shrub communities. Let's talk about beaches and dunes first. Coastal engineers have been using dune and beach restoration for something on the order of 100 years. What's different now is looking at the ecological processes in the dune as well, particularly the dune vegetation, how it makes the dune more stable and helps it recover after storms. So we want to look at the morphology, evolution during storm events, understand the services rendered by coastal vegetation, and then the recovery after events. We've got ongoing work at our field research facility in Duck, North Carolina, where we're observing Dune changes both north and south of the pier. This dune has been fairly stable, but about 5 years ago, we started to see some significant erosion on the north side and have been studying not only the dune itself, but the vegetation. We've also been doing some laboratory work. This is some work of Duncan Bryant, looking at the effects of both above ground and below ground biomass in the resilience of a dune, looking at the dune shape before running large waves on it and what it looks like with both above ground and below ground biomass, only below ground, only above ground, and no vegetation at all. We can see it has a very significant impact. Vegetative features in the form of marshes and wetlands have also garnered a lot of attention. We need to understand the engineering performance of that vegetation in terms of reducing the surge and the waves, the velocities, and also the net trapping of sediment within wetlands. Some of the questions that are of interest is, can we scale these performance measures to large extreme events? Most of the work has been done in relatively small events. How does the vegetation change seasonally? Is it as effective when it's not in its main growing season? And how do we represent that in the models? What are the timescales for recovery after storms in case we have these events back to back? And how does the function of the vegetation change as the water level goes up? There have been a number of laboratory studies, some ongoing at ERDIC and other places, and numerical efforts. There's also some nice field work going on in coastal Virginia. Islands have long been seen as one of the first defenses for our coastlines, in berms and submerged islands as well. Got a number of examples here. The first one is Barrier Island restoration. This is an example from post-Katrina of an island called Ship Island off the Mississippi coast. The island was split during Hurricane Camille in the 1960s and then eroded much more during Hurricane Katrina. Modeling was done to look at the stability of the island, the protection it provides to the interior coastline from waves and storm surge, and also the environmental impacts, how it affects the habitat and the endangered species in the sound area behind. Assateague Island in Maryland is a national seashore and wildlife refuge. There was a desire to keep it as natural as possible, and so there was very little shore protection that was provided there. But seeing the island erode, techniques were investigated to look at how you could take sand from the ebb shoal, place it on the beach or near the beach to provide sand into the system and prevent breaching or loss of habitat on the island. Particularly of interest was the piping plover habitat, which likes to have these overwash features. Beneficial use of dredge material is also a very important topic. The Corps of Engineers dredges a lot of sediment to keep our channels open, and the majority of that is not used beneficially. Here's a few examples of good news stories on how that sediment can be used beneficial. This one in the Atchafalaya River, sediment was placed in such a way to form islands and direct the flow, which in the end ended up reducing dredging costs. There's also examples of placing sediment near shore. Near shore placement has advantages of winnowing out some of the fine materials that couldn't be placed on the beach, also breaking wave energy. And in some cases, the sediment also moves on and nourishes the beach. I haven't talked about all the different natural and nature-based features that we could consider, but in the end, there's a range of solutions. And we're interested in how some of these different solutions interact with each other. We need to understand their engineering attributes, their dependencies and interactions, how they evolve in both the long-term and short-term, and the range of both environmental and social benefits, as well as economic benefits. There's an effort going on to develop some international guidelines on the use of natural nature-based features. This is an interagency, as well as including non-government agencies, academia, NGOs, and some private firms. This is an effort led by Todd Bridges. It's trying to bring together the knowledge of what we know about natural nature-based features and has a section on coastal applications. This includes wetlands, dunes and beaches, islands, systems, talks about adaption, and talks about monitoring. This document should be published in early 2021. Non-structural measures is a technique that's oftentimes not popular in coastal engineering. It might involve buyouts or moving of communities. As part of the Mississippi Coastal Improvement Project following Hurricane Katrina, buyouts were applied on the Mississippi coast, part of an integrated plan. So these non-structural measures can be part of this comprehensive approach to reduce risks. There's a great deal of uncertainty in what future conditions will bring. So adaptation is another powerful tool to incorporate climate change considerations into design. When developing a design, it's important to consider a range of potential future sea levels. The Corps of Engineers looks at 3 different sea level projections when we design projects. Another approach within that is building multiple lines of defense to make it more robust, and then planning adaption into projects for features on a decadal scale. On the right here is an example for a project that's been studied on Staten Island in New York Bay. There's 3 different types of structures that have been proposed, and each one has an adaptive capability. For levees, the case here was to purchase extra real estate for the purpose of being able to raise and widen the levees as sea level rise progresses. The second structure included parapet walls, and the structure was designed in such a way that these walls could be increased in elevation with sea level rise. Or with flood walls, again, the foundation was designed in such a way that the flood wall elevation could be increased in the future. To design robust projects, we need to have a probabilistic coastal hazard assessment framework. We need to robustly calculate what the coastal hazard is. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is building such a system using numerical models and statistical methods for risk-informed decision-making. We use high-fidelity models linked together in the coastal storm modeling system. We use these models to run both synthetic and historical storms, accumulate those in the database to provide information about the climatology, and then develop the statistical probabilistic methods to evaluate what levels of flooding we can expect. Once we have this large database, we can also use surrogate modeling methods to develop very fast simulation methods that can be used real time to produce real-time prediction of water levels for operations and emergency support. So the database can be used in both the planning, engineering design, and a real-time operations. I have just 2 more topics about increasing resilience, and the first one is data. We've always needed data in coastal engineering to understand the processes, to build models, to validate models, to evaluate our projects. And now we have lots of new remote sensing methodologies to allow us to collect even more data. This is an example of a mini Argus system, a much smaller system, portable, much less expensive, that's being used to evaluate projects over time. You can look at the adaption requirements of a project, the renourishment increments needed for a beach fill project. Other techniques use citizen science to look at flood levels, to look at the evolution of the beach, and then finally looking at satellite information. There's so much satellite information out there that the coastal community is only starting to use now. So we really need to improve our ability to use this remote sensing data and integrate these data into our planning processes. Finally, we can improve coastal resilience by building coastal communities of practice. And I'm just going to show one example of a program we call the U.S. Coastal Research Program. It's an interagency U.S. program that's been active since about 2017. It's got 4 goals. One is as a community coming together and identifying research priorities, enhancing the amount of funding. We've really seen a decrease in the amount of funding going to universities and therefore less students in coastal engineering. And so this enhanced funding is very important to build up that student population. Foster collaboration between agencies and with academics. And finally, to promote science translation. How do we get these this knowledge and information into the hands of stakeholders, state, local, and national. So we've talked about a number of ways to be more resilient. Performing rigorous risk-based system hazard assessments, including the non-stationarity and uncertainty due to climate change. Expand our vision to diversify project benefits, not only focus on the economics, but also focus on the ecosystem and the social benefits. Mainstream the use of natural nature-based features. These are great because they have the capacity or the capability to adapt to changing sea level conditions. Document case studies, and leverage experiments of opportunity. The USCRP has been bringing together groups that are working together and collecting some very interesting data sets. The use of low cost and remote monitoring data. We have a lot of opportunities to do that we haven't jumped on yet. Build in adaptive capability into our projects. Commit to using innovation. What can we do that's different and better? Let's think outside the boxes. And then finally, to collaborate across disciplines, particularly in environmental and ecological areas, and with stakeholders so that we maximize the impact of our projects and our research. Thank you. Are there any questions?